review session. Feel free to throw in any questions you guys have as the review session's going on, or else if you need any more clarification. Looks like we've got a good number of questions tonight, and so we'll try to get through as many of them as clearly as we can. For you guys, also remember you guys can come and ask me any questions you want to before the test takes place tomorrow, and we should be good. Review session starts with a question that came up a while ago. It was asking about the Homestead Act of 1862. This question is dealing with an action that Lincoln took during the Civil War, where Lincoln is trying to figure out a way to fill up the western frontier and encourage farmers to move out west so that they can become farmers to help out with the war effort. He's also hoping to settle the West with people who are free farmers, so that when slave states possibly think about expanding, they'll find the territories out west filled. So the Homestead Act said in 1862, if you establish a farm on the western frontier, they'll give you 160 acres from the federal government. If you work it for 5 years, you will then be able to make that. Sorry, I got distracted. If you work it for 5 years and you improve the land, then you have the right to purchase the land for a small price when it comes time for you to become the owner of that property. Most of the people who became homesteaders went bankrupt, and so it sounds like a great deal, but unfortunately the land was too small for them to make a good go of it. You guys will be playing the game of being a homesteader in the next couple weeks as we move into the upcoming chapter, so that'll be one of the simulations you'll be able to test drive. Next question asks, in winning Illinois, how did it hurt Douglas's career of presidency? This is talking about the senatorial race in 1858, and this kind of goes along with a question that was asked later in the review sheet about the Freeport Doctrine. So if you remember, during the Senate race between Lincoln and Douglas in 1858, the two of them took turns pounding on each other. Douglas made sure to describe Lincoln as being a radical who was too extreme. Douglas, on the other hand, got painted into a corner with the Freeport Doctrine, where he was asked, do you believe in the Dred Scott ruling, or do you believe in popular sovereignty? And where the South wanted to hear Douglas say that he was in favor of Dred Scott, he instead said that he was in favor of popular sovereignty, and that helped to really derail his chances of becoming the candidate in 1860 for the South. It's why they chose Breckinridge instead of Douglas, because they felt he was a little bit too soft on slavery, especially after he rejected the Lecompton Constitution. That's another question that is later in the review sheet that we set up, but we'll get to that as well. Lecompton is during the Bleeding Kansas controversy, where the slave owners in Kansas created a constitution that was rigged so that they would be able to win the constitutional fight, or else they would just be pushed on to a later date. The way that the Lecompton Constitution worked was either you as a person in the state of Kansas could vote to make the Constitution slave, or else you could vote to keep slavery in the state while they waited till a later date to figure out what their Constitution would look like. So either way, no matter how you voted, you were voting pro-slavery. A bunch of anti-slavery people stayed away from voting for that. When the bill ended up in front of Buchanan, he tried to ram it through Congress, and Douglas shut that down because it was corrupt. And so that's the two things that are going to mess up Douglas: Freeport Doctrine in 1858, and then also the Lecompton Constitution. Both of those signal to the South that he's way too moderate on the issue of slavery, and they're not really certain if they like him when it comes to national election. The next question: what does the term rail splitter mean? Exactly what it says. So imagine a guy with an axe who is cutting fence rails with an axe, like an outdoorsy sort of person would. That's the reputation they're going to give to Lincoln. So when you look at Lincoln's election, even though he's a Republican, he's coming from that group of Whigs who helped Zachary Taylor get elected and William Henry Harrison get elected, by trying to de-emphasize the details of the life and make him look a little bit more like a common man, like Andrew Jackson. And so that's what they're trying to do with Lincoln, is they're describing him as being a rail splitter. He's being described as Honest Abe growing up in a log cabin. And so that's what's attracting people to him. The next question on the list: what does Dixie mean? I actually had to look this up to find out why the term came to be used. Dixie is coming from the French term dix, which is 10, D-I-X. And so down in Louisiana, there was a bank that was putting out banknotes in the early time of our history. And because the banknotes on the back, since it was French Louisiana, since it said DIX on the back, instead of pronouncing it Dix, it was pronounced Dix. And so you had Dixie as being a location in the South that was kind of getting its nickname from the money that was being circulated down there. So Dixie is just the South, and that's the term that they're using for that. Next question is bounty jumpers. Bounty jumpers are going to be the people who are accepting bounties, especially in the North, from rich people, so they'd get paid a chunk of money to volunteer for the United States Army. Rich people would pay $300 to stay out of the war, and so bounty jumpers are taking their bounty for serving for a rich person. Then when they get into the military, they're quickly running away, going AWOL, absent without official leave. And so then they'll be going back and trying to claim another bounty to get as much money as they can from rich people who are trying to stay out of the Civil War. So that's what the bounty jumpers are up to. Next question, why did Lincoln reject the Crittenden Compromise? Lincoln was worried that he was the first president who was a Republican, and because of that, if he was accepting compromises where he had to cave in on his principles and do whatever the opposition said, even though they lost, then why would it be worthwhile for his party to ever get elected president? And so for Lincoln, he's willing to be flexible as far as working with the South, but he's not willing to cave in because they're blackmailing him with secession. His feeling is that if he caves in now, then other people will just keep doing that same thing over and over again, and the North will lose all power because the South will just keep blackmailing the North. The next question is, please explain profiteers and shoddy goods. You had people in both the North and the South, but especially in the North, who were selling goods to the United States government that were of really poor quality. It was shoddy, and they were trying to make as much money as they could off the government. So they would sell moldy food to the United States government. They would sell uniforms that were no good, shoes that were no good. So while we talked about the benefits of the industrialization that happened in the North, not all of it was beautiful. So you had a lot of people who were serving in the military with goods that were produced on the cheap by people who were trying to make as much money off of government contracts as they possibly could. It asked the question, why were there so many millionaires in the United States during this time period? And that's partially the reason why, is the government had tons of money in greenbacks to spend. They're looking for factories to produce tons of materials, and they could never produce enough materials to actually supply the war effort. There would always be a need for more guns, for more bullets, more everything. And so some people are doing that irresponsible with the government. And so that's what's going on with profiteering. People are trying to figure out ways to gouge the government for as much money as they can, and a lot of times they're selling products to the government that aren't of the quality that they should be. Next question is, what was the Butternut region? Butternut region is just an area in southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and it's the place where anti-slavery language wouldn't be very good. This is where a lot of runaway slaves would go if they were on the Underground Railroad. These are the people who, when Lincoln and Douglas are debating, and Douglas is baiting the crowd by pointing out all the ways that Lincoln is talking about favoring African Americans, many people in the Butternut region are going to be really nervous about a guy like Lincoln, because they are going to be afraid that he is a radical abolitionist who's hiding his true motives for what he's up to. Let me see here. Next question, how do battles work exactly? If one side kills the troops on the other side, why do they suddenly do what the other side says? The reason why you have that going on with conflict is the military resistance is done after the war is finished up, and there isn't a military resistance left to oppose what the government is saying. So you're going to see, after the war is finished, for the Civil War, the North is going to impose its will on the South. They're going to ask them to show that they're loyal, and the South will refuse to do that. So, like your question is asking, the other side in the Civil War didn't do what the North told them to do immediately after the war. They tried to resist as much as they possibly could. What the North then did is they carved up the South into military regions and put military control into the South. And they took away a lot of the freedoms that Southerners were wanting, because they were resisting the attempts to reconstruct both physically and then also to try to reconstruct what African Americans were going to be treated like. And so for about 13 years, from 1865 to 77, you're going to have a battle going on between North and South. Where the North won the war, the South still actively trying to go as possible the integration so that they can hopefully try to keep black people in a second-class position that they can't get out of. And what you're going to see is, unlike what your comment was, the South's going to do a really good job where they're going to figure out ways to keep African Americans socially, politically, economically segregated all the way through the 1960s, when they're still trying to root out de jure segregation, which means segregation that's on the law books. And for many people, they would argue that there's still elements of that around nowadays in our society with prejudice and racism that they'll be easy to point out to you. So I think it's a complicated question wrapped up into a really simple comment on the line. But I think you're going to find with Chapter 22, the North isn't going to be able to get done what they want to with reconstructing what the South is up to. How did the Europeans react to the Civil War? The Europeans were torn. The Europeans were looking for a huge win on either the northern or the southern side so they could figure out who to unite with. More business was being done with the North because the North had heavily industrialized, and so they were still able to trade during the Civil War. You had some people in Europe who were helping out the Southerners, but they were a little bit nervous to do so too aggressively because of the South loss, like they were pretty much guaranteed to do. Then they'd have to deal with an angry United States who'd be really having problems with a country that tried to stir rebellion here in the home country. So Europeans were kind of waiting for that big Saratoga-style moment, and we believe Antietam or Gettysburg could have been that moment, but for the South, neither one of those battles turned into that sort of moment where the Europeans then jumped 100% behind them. Why didn't Dred Scott sue for his freedom while he was still in the North? Dred Scott is the simple reason Dred Scott was inside of a military complex in Fort Snelling, surrounded by other soldiers, and his owner was one of the commanding officers who was visiting the fort from St. Louis, Missouri. And so the idea that Dred Scott would get soldiers in Fort Snelling to side with him over a military officer, it's really hard to imagine that there'd be a whole lot of soldiers who would be interested in taking that on, especially since the federal government had never dealt with that. The way that Dred Scott was able to bring his case was his owner passed away. His wife, the wife of the previous slave owner, sold him, and then through subsequent owners, he was able to bring a case as a test case against an owner who there was an arrangement set up where they worked together to try to test this case out in the Supreme Court. So he's not a traditional slave with a traditional relationship that you would normally expect for somebody who is deep in the South. There's something extraordinary going on there that allows him to bring this case. Let me see here. Why couldn't Lincoln be in office until 4 months later? Remember, that's going to be that lame duck period where you hold the election in November, and then where Donald Trump is still over a month and a half away the person's and plans so that they can come into the White House without being rushed. The idea that all of a sudden the day after the election they would then bounce in the White House and take over immediately would be problematic. But obviously there are other problems that you see with Lincoln, where because Buchanan was still in the office for so long, he allowed the South to split apart and disintegrate, and Lincoln wasn't involved to actually stop that from happening. Let's see here. What was Lincoln's mid-road solution? Lincoln is trying to figure out ways to end the Civil War and end slavery without stoking the fears and paranoia of what's happening in the South. And so you'll notice that there's a approach when he's working his way through the Civil War, where initially he's only fighting over Union. Then he creates the Emancipation Proclamation. Then he's going to go with, after Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, announcing that we're going to unite in a new birth of freedom. But each and every time that he does this, it's not with the idea of forcing radical Reconstruction on the South and quickly emancipating everyone, giving everybody equal rights. And in fact, we're left with an unclear record of what Lincoln would have looked like when he was reconstructing the South. We do see, after the Civil War is done, though, we do have a group called the Radical Republicans in Congress who are much more aggressive than what Lincoln wants to do. And we're left with the question of, was that the right path compared to what Lincoln would have done? And unfortunately, since he died, we can't really come up with that. But his middle road is trying to figure out a way to go between nothing with the ending of slavery and what the radicals are up to, which is scaring the South pretty badly. What was the slave emancipation policy? There were a number of them, and so early in the Civil War, when slaves were set free from the South, they were initially put onto plantations in the border states in the North to help out with the war effort. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to shift that in January of 1863, where you're going to have a shift, and African Americans will now be given their freedom when the Northern troops travel through rebellious areas that haven't surrendered. Then we'll see, as we move through the Civil War, we move on to the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. 13th Amendment will officially get rid of slavery. 14th is going to make African American citizens. 15th will give them the right to vote. So gradually you're going to see African Americans becoming emancipated and then getting more and more rights as we move into Chapter 22. We've already covered the Lecompton Constitution. You can let me know if you need more about that. Explain Dred Scott versus Stanford. Dred Scott versus Stanford is going to be a court case, like we discussed. A slave is taken by his master up to Minnesota to Fort Snelling, and because that territory was just a territory, not a state, but it was north of the Missouri Compromise line, there was a question about whether or not Dred Scott should actually still be a slave, because he was brought into a territory that should have been free. For Dred Scott, he ran into a Supreme Court justice in Taney, though, who was looking to fix the slave situation and fix it in favor of the South. So Taney is going to rule that Dred Scott's still a slave, and because of that, because he's black, he's not allowed to sue because he's not a citizen. Secondarily, he's going to argue that slaves are property and can be taken anywhere as long as the state hasn't set up rules, because Taney is very much a states' rights sort of person, so he'll allow the states to outlaw slavery, but he'll argue that the federal government can't. And so his decision is going to open up slavery into all the unaffiliated territories that haven't determined their statehood yet, and that's going to wipe out the Missouri Compromise line. Let me see here. We already covered the Crittenden Compromise. Battle of Shiloh is a southern battle that is going to be a major battle in the South, where we're going to have Grant's progress slowed down on the Mississippi. And it's going to be one of those elements that's going to be convincing Lincoln that we need to be more aggressive with our war tactics because things are going so slowly. I don't anticipate a lot of questions about Shiloh on the test, but it's one of those battles that's bringing us closer to Lincoln, putting Grant and Sherman in charge of all the military so they can aggressively attack the South like we saw today. First and second Battle of Bull Run. Both of the reason why they're first and second is they both are happening in the same physical location. The first Battle of Bull Run was the first land battle that happened just outside of Washington, D.C. The second Battle of Bull Run happened about a year later. Both of them are sending signals out to the United States that this war is not going to be wrapping up soon. It's going to be a long slog until 1865 because these battles are decisive. See here. Can you explain the Reform Bill of 1867? It's not a huge element of this course for us to be taking a look at English history. They provide in your textbook to show how many other countries are taking the lead of the United States, where when we start adding, during Jackson's presidency, more common men to be voting for white males, and then we add in African-American men following the Civil War, we're setting the lead inside the United States for providing suffrage, the right to vote, even though you'll notice that women aren't allowed to vote, and we've still got a lot of barriers that are left because of what's going to happen during Reconstruction. The Reform Bill in 1867 is showing you that other countries are trying to mimic what we're up to with the Reform Bill, in Britain. They're trying to expand voting to more people who haven't been allowed to vote in the past. Let me see here. The next question is from Fecal Boy 92. Great. Please tell me more about the Homestead Act and its impact. I'm confused by it. If you still have problems, we covered that at the beginning about 10 minutes ago. If you could be more specific about what it is that you want to have covered, other than the fact that it's just 160 acres of land out west that the government is giving away to farmers. They'll be expected to work for 5 years, improve it, and if they do those things, then they'll be able to purchase that land for a really small price. It's intending to fill up the western frontier so that if the South does end up with a partial victory, the West will be filled up with all of these small farmers, and there won't be space for plantations out west, but it'll also provide supplies and resources that are needed for the North to fight the Civil War. Let me see here. Can I explain the Emancipation Proclamation? Emancipation Proclamation is going to be the announcement made after Antietam, where Lincoln said if anybody wants to quit the Civil War and rejoin the North, you get to keep your slaves. But you had to do that by January 1st, 1863. Otherwise, any areas that were still in rebellion, the slaves were considered free in those areas. And as the Union started moving through the areas into the southern territories, any slaves that they encountered, they would then set them free, so that they would be a problem, first of all, for the South, because all of their economy would be blown up by all their slaves running away. But then all of a sudden, those African Americans could also be used in the Northern war effort to help build bridges, build forts, and eventually they'll be enlisted into the military to try to help out with the war effort. Let me see here. Why did Bill Clinton get impeached? We'll get to that much later in the course. Let me see. I am confused why Lincoln rejected print compromise and also why he take L's. I'm not sure what that means. For Lincoln, he rejected the Crittenden Compromise because he didn't want to be seen as caving in to Southerners who were rebelling. He was instead interested in trying to figure out a way to govern as a Republican. He didn't want to get rid of slavery in the places where it existed, but the South didn't believe him. And so when they started seceding, he felt that it was his responsibility to then be able to help out with the war effort to try to keep the country united, because that was his main focus. Can I explain the political parties in these years? Absolutely. So when you take a look at Chapter 19, 19 is the path to the Civil War. And so you've got in 19, the Whig Party is disintegrating. You have the Know-Nothings who are anti-immigrant. You've got the Free Soilers who are trying to keep African Americans out of the western frontier. And then eventually they're going to merge together into the Republicans. The Democrats are going to split into a northern and southern group, and that northern group will be known as the Copperheads during the Civil War. They're seen as traitors, but there's a solid chunk, 45% of the voters in 1864, who are interested in what the Democrats are up to try to stop the war, because they're not excited about what Lincoln is up to. Let's see here. What was the book Impending Crisis of the South about? The Impending Crisis of the South, written by Hinton R. Helper, came right before the Civil War took place. With Hinton R. Helper, he's going to be a Southerner who's going to be arguing that the North is on the right track and the South is slipping backwards by just sticking with cotton. And so all he talks about is figuring out ways to diversify the economy so that he's able to get more production from different places. He wants to build factories in the South. He wants to have food grown in the South. He doesn't just want cotton. And he argues that the quicker they get that done, the more they can compete with the North. This book shouldn't have been controversial, but it was. The Speaker of the House battle before the Civil War actually became a battle over whether or not Hinton R. Helper was a good guy to emulate. And a candidate for Speaker of the House is going to end up losing because of the fact that he is going to be in favor of Hinton R. Helper. The book gets banned throughout the Deep South. And so this book becomes controversial, even though all he's saying is they should just diversify their economy. It's a great example to use to explain why the South is becoming so radical. They're so paranoid that even something as simple as this seems like it's controversial. Let me see here. It looks like I'm to the end of all of my questions for tonight. And so if you have any other questions, feel free to email. For you guys also, if you want to stop by before class tomorrow, I'd be happy to help you guys with any questions you guys have. Otherwise, it looks like we've hit the end of our stack, and so it's good to have you guys here with me tonight. Hopefully your review goes well, and I will see you tomorrow morning. Bye, guys.